What would you do if one rainy night you found three abandoned children on the side of the road, cold, scared, and utterly alone? Officer Ethan Cole thought the worst storm of his life had already passed. After the devastating loss of his son, his marriage to Sophie has crumbled, and his once bright home has fallen into darkness. But one fateful night, as lightning lights up the drenched streets, Ethan comes across a young boy clutching two fragile infants. Abandoned in the pouring rain, these children need more than just a savior. They need someone willing to uncover the dark secrets that left them in the storm. Ethan's discovery pulls him into a heart-wrenching mystery, one that leads straight to a corrupt orphanage and a trafficking ring hiding in plain sight. As he digs deeper, he uncovers horrifying truths, not only about the town but also about his own son's tragic death. Will Ethan seek justice, or will his desire for vengeance consume him? In a world where the line between right and wrong blurs, Ethan must make a choice that will change his life, and the children's, forever. Beneath the Rain is a gripping, emotional journey of grief, redemption, and the lengths one man will go to find the truth. Ethan Cole turned the key in the front door, the usual sound of its creak barely registering. He stepped inside, shaking off the rain as he pulled his jacket from his broad shoulders and hung it on the hook. The house was cold, physically and emotionally. Silence wrapped around him like a heavy blanket. He glanced at the hallway that led to their son's room. The door cracked open just enough for a slice of dim light to show. Sophie was in there. Again. Taking a deep breath, Ethan ran a hand through his damp hair and made his way down the hall. Sophie sat on the floor, her knees pulled up to her chest, her back against the dresser where their son's clothes still lay folded. She didn't look up when Ethan entered. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice low and careful. He hated the way the words felt so useless. Sophie's eyes stayed fixed on the stuffed bear sitting on the bed, one their son used to cuddle. The weight of her silence filled the room. "I'm heading out for patrol. I'll be back late," Ethan added, though he knew there would be no reply. He hesitated, wanting to say more, wanting to reach her, but the distance between them felt insurmountable. It had been that way ever since the accident. With a resigned sigh, Ethan turned and left, grabbing his keys as he headed out the door into the relentless downpour. The rain hit the windshield with such force that the wipers struggled to keep up. Ethan's patrol car crept along the empty streets, the beam of his headlights cutting through the gloom. He'd driven this route 1,000 times before, but tonight something was different. The storm mirrored the tempest inside him, swirling with grief, guilt, and the ever-present ache of loss. As lightning cracked across the sky, it illuminated a small figure on the sidewalk ahead. Ethan blinked, unsure if his eyes were playing tricks on him. But when the lightning flashed again, the figure was still there. A boy, standing alone, drenched to the bone, holding what looked like two small bundles. Ethan's heart skipped. He slowed the car and pulled to the side of the road, stepping out into the rain. The boy didn't move, didn't even flinch as Ethan approached. His face was pale, his clothes soaked and clinging to his thin frame. Two babies, one in each arm, shivered in his embrace. "Hey, are you okay?" Ethan crouched down, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. The boy looked up at him, eyes wide with fear, but too exhausted to react. I don't know what to do," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding rain. Ethan took a deep breath, his heart aching at the sight of the frail child and the helpless babies. "Let me help. It's going to be okay." Carefully, Ethan reached out and took the babies into his arms, their tiny bodies cold to the touch. He quickly led the boy toward his car, opening the back door and ushering them inside. The rain poured harder, as if nature itself was trying to drown out the horror of the situation. Ethan glanced at the rearview mirror as he drove through the storm, the boy sitting silently in the back seat, staring out the window. The babies had stopped crying, though they still trembled under the blankets Ethan had wrapped around them. "What's your name?" Ethan asked, his tone gentle. "Leo," the boy murmured. "Where are your parents, Leo?" "I don't have parents," Leo replied, his voice flat. "We were at the orphanage, but they left us." Ethan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Who left you?" "A woman. She told us to wait outside. Then she drove away." It was raining, but she didn't come back. Leo's voice cracked, and he wiped his eyes quickly, trying to hide the tears. Ethan's stomach churned. What about the babies? Are they your sisters? Leo shook his head. No, they're from the orphanage, too. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't just leave them there. The sincerity in Leo's words struck Ethan deeply. This child, no older than 10, had taken on the responsibility of caring for these babies, while the people who should have protected him had abandoned him. We're going to get you all somewhere safe, Ethan promised, though he knew the road ahead was far from simple. He pressed his foot on the gas, the police station looming ahead like a refuge from the storm that raged both outside and within. The station was quiet when Ethan pulled up, the rain still pouring as he carried the babies inside, Leo trailing close behind. His colleague, Officer Dave, looked up from his desk, eyes widening at the sight of Ethan soaked and carrying 2 infants. What the hell happened? Dave asked, standing quickly. Found them on the street. No parents. They were abandoned, Ethan said, his tone clipped. Dave glanced at Leo, then back at Ethan. You need to call social services. Ethan bristled at the suggestion. I'm not handing them over to strangers without knowing what's going on. Something's wrong here, Dave. The kid says they came from the orphanage, and there's more to this story. Look, I get it, but we have protocols, Dave said, lowering his voice. You can't take this personally. Ethan shot him a look. I'm not walking away from this, Dave sighed, backing off. All right, but you're putting yourself in a tight spot. Ethan didn't respond. He focused on settling the babies into a quiet corner of the station, wrapping them in fresh blankets. Leo stood nearby, watching every move with wide eyes. Ethan couldn't help but see his own son in the boy's scared face. He knelt down to meet Leo's gaze. You did good, Leo. You kept them safe. Leo's lip trembled, but he nodded. For the first time since Ethan found him, the boy's guard began to drop. Later that night, after the babies had been cared for and Leo was resting in a spare room, Ethan sat at his desk, the rain still hammering against the window. His mind raced as he searched through the station's database, typing in the name of the orphanage Leo had mentioned. What he found only deepened his suspicions. There were reports, children missing, records incomplete, adoptions that had no follow-up, but nothing concrete. Every complaint seemed to vanish into thin air, the investigations going nowhere. And the name Victoria Marsh, the orphanage director, came up again and again. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched. Something was wrong, and whatever it was, it went deeper than a few abandoned children. He glanced over at the room where Leo and the twins slept, their small lives hanging in the balance. He couldn't let this go. He had to find out the truth, and he would start by looking into Victoria Marsh. Ethan stepped into the house, his boots still damp from the storm outside. The weight of the day clung to him, heavier than the soaked clothes he wore. To his surprise, Sophie was sitting in the living room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. It was the first time in weeks she hadn't been locked away in their son's room. She looked up as he entered, her eyes scanning him for something, though Ethan wasn't sure what. He caught her glance shift to the 2 baby carriers sitting near the door. The twins, Emily and Emma, slept quietly, their soft breaths the only sound in the room. Leo was in the spare room, fast asleep after the ordeal of the day. Sophie spoke, her voice fragile but present. Who are they? Ethan exhaled, relieved to hear her voice but unsure how to explain. He sat down across from her, rubbing his temples. I found them, he said, glancing at the twins, abandoned in the rain. The boy, Leo, he's been taking care of them. They were left by the orphanage. Sophie's expression softened as she looked at the babies, but a shadow of pain flickered across her face. For a brief moment, she seemed to consider the enormity of it all. The thought of children, so vulnerable, so alone. Her gaze drifted back to Ethan. What's going to happen to them? She asked, her voice tight. I don't know yet, Ethan replied. I'm looking into it. Something's not right with that orphanage, Sophie. These kids, they weren't just abandoned. Sophie was silent for a long time, her eyes fixed on the twins. Then, with a slow, almost hesitant movement, she stood and walked toward the babies. Ethan watched as she knelt down beside their carriers, gently brushing a hand across one of their foreheads. "They're so small," she whispered. For the first time since their son's death, Ethan saw something flicker in Sophie, a faint glimmer of the woman she had been. But just as quickly, she withdrew, her hand trembling as she pulled away. Without another word, she disappeared down the hall, retreating into her familiar isolation. The next morning, Ethan found Leo sitting at the kitchen table, staring out the window. The boy had been quiet since they arrived at the station, his thin frame curled up in the chair. The twins slept peacefully in the living room, but Leo looked like he hadn't slept at all. Ethan sat down across from him, offering a gentle smile. "You okay, buddy?" Leo shrugged, his eyes still distant. Ethan leaned forward, trying to bridge the gap between them. "Leo, I need you to help me understand what happened. Can you tell me more about the orphanage? About the woman who left you?" Leo hesitated, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his shirt. For a moment, Ethan thought the boy wouldn't speak. But then, in a small, shaky voice, Leo began. "It wasn't a good place," he whispered. "The kids there, a lot of them are gone now. They just disappear. Some of them get adopted, but some just don't come back." Ethan's heart tightened. He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it confirmed by Leo made it real. "What about the twins?" Ethan asked gently. "Why did she leave you and the babies?" Leo swallowed hard. "She said we weren't good enough to be adopted. The twins are too small, and she said I was too old. She didn't care. She just left us." The boy's words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He could see the weight Leo carried, the fear and responsibility that no child should have to bear. Ethan placed a hand on Leo's shoulder. "You did the right thing, Leo," he said, his voice firm. "You protected them. I'm going to make sure you're all safe, okay?" Leo nodded, but the worry in his eyes didn't fade. Ethan knew this was just the beginning. There was something much darker lurking behind the walls of that orphanage. Ethan parked outside the orphanage, his eyes taking in the dilapidated building. The peeling paint, the broken windows, it all screamed neglect. He stepped out of the car, the afternoon sun barely cutting through the overcast sky. As he approached the front door, a woman appeared, her sharp eyes sizing him up before she forced a smile. Victoria Marsh, the director of the orphanage. Her pristine appearance contrasted sharply with the state of the building. "Officer Cole, I presume," she said smoothly, extending a hand. "How can I help you today?" Ethan shook her hand but didn't return the smile. "I'm here to check in on some things. I found a couple of kids last night, Leo and 2 infants. They said they were from here." Victoria's smile faltered for a split second before she regained her composure. "Ah, yes. Leo. That poor boy. I was so worried when he left. We had hoped to find a home for him, but unfortunately, there haven't been many opportunities. As for the babies, they were simply waiting for placement. It must have been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Ethan repeated, his voice cool. "They were left on the street in the middle of a storm." "That's not a misunderstanding." Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, but she maintained her calm demeanor. "I assure you, officer, we have only the best intentions for the children in our care. We do everything we can to ensure their safety." Ethan didn't believe a word she said, but without hard evidence, he had to play it cool. He nodded, but his gut told him something was off. "I'll be following up on this," Ethan said, turning to leave. "I'll be in touch." Victoria's smile didn't waver, but Ethan could feel the tension in the air as he walked away. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria Marsh was hiding something. As he drove back from the orphanage, his mind raced with possibilities. Leo's story, the strange behavior of the staff. It all pointed to something far more sinister than neglect. He pulled over at a quiet park, the sound of the rain still faintly echoing in his mind. Opening his laptop, he began digging into public records, looking for anything that could explain the orphanage's dark secrets. What he found only confirmed his worst fears. There were dozens of adoption records, but most of them were incomplete or suspiciously vague. Children had gone missing without any follow-up, and many of the documents Victoria had submitted were filled with inconsistencies. Ethan's heart pounded as he scanned through the files. This wasn't just negligence. This was deliberate. Children were being trafficked, sold under the guise of adoption, and then disappearing without a trace. He leaned back in his seat, his jaw clenched. This was bigger than he'd imagined, and it wasn't going to be easy to take Victoria down. By the time Ethan arrived home, it was late. The house was quiet, but as he stepped inside, he saw Sophie in the living room, cradling one of the twins in her arms. The sight stopped him in his tracks. Sophie looked up as he entered, her eyes soft but filled with a sadness that hadn't quite left. I fed her. She was fussy. Ethan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Thank you. Sophie looked down at the baby, her fingers gently stroking her hair. They're so innocent. I don't understand how anyone could abandon them. Ethan sat down beside her, his heart heavy with everything he had learned. He wanted to protect these children, but the weight of his own grief, of losing their son, was still a wound that hadn't healed. Sophie's voice broke through his thoughts. I know you're trying to fix this, Ethan, but don't lose yourself in it. He met her gaze, her words a reminder that while he was fighting for these children, he also had to fight for his family. I won't, Ethan said, his voice steady. But I have to do this. Sophie nodded, though her eyes held a quiet fear. Just promise me you'll be careful. I promise, he said, taking her hand. I'll protect them, and I'll protect us. As they sat together in the silence, the rain outside finally began to ease, but Ethan knew the storm was far from over. Ethan sat at his desk in the police station, the dim glow of his computer screen casting shadows across his face. His eyes scanned the orphanage's adoption records once again. No matter how hard he looked, the details didn't add up. Children listed as adopted had no follow-up, no verification, and no trace of their new families. He rubbed his temples, feeling the exhaustion tug at him, but he couldn't stop. His gut told him this wasn't just negligence. Something darker was at play. The door to the office creaked open, and Officer Dave stepped in, holding a cup of coffee in each hand. I thought you might need this, Dave said, placing one on Ethan's desk. Ethan glanced up and nodded gratefully. Thanks. I need something to keep me going. Dave took a seat across from him, sipping his own coffee. You've been on this for days, Ethan. What are you hoping to find? Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, Dave. Every time I look at this, it gets worse. The kids at that orphanage aren't just being neglected. They're disappearing. Dave raised an eyebrow. Disappearing? Ethan nodded, pulling up a series of adoption files on the screen. Look at these. Kids supposedly adopted, but the paperwork is incomplete. No follow-up visits, no confirmation that the kids ever made it to these so-called families. Dave frowned, leaning in closer. That's not right. No, it's not. And Leo told me something even worse. He said the kids that don't get adopted, they just vanish. No one talks about them. It's like they never existed. Dave let out a low whistle. So, what do you think is really happening? I don't know yet, Ethan said, his voice low. But I have a feeling Victoria Marsh is more involved than she's letting on. This isn't just incompetence. It's deliberate. Dave set his cup down, leaning forward. You're gonna need more than a hunch, Ethan. You know that. Especially if this goes as deep as you think. Ethan nodded, determination hardening his expression. I know. That's why I need your help. I can't do this alone. Dave's eyes met Ethan's, a silent agreement passing between them. All right, Dave said, his voice firm. I'm in. But be careful, Ethan. You're going up against powerful people. They don't like being poked. The air in the station felt colder as Ethan and Dave began pulling records, both from the police database and external sources. It was tedious work, cross-referencing names, addresses, and adoption records. But with each new search, the pattern became clearer. This doesn't make any sense, Dave muttered, scrolling through the screen in front of him. Why would so many kids from the same orphanage go missing without a single investigation? Because someone's covering it up, Ethan said. His voice had grown sharper over the past few hours, each new discovery tightening the knot of anxiety in his chest. He pulled up another file, one that had caught his attention earlier. It was for a child named Isabel, supposedly adopted 2 years ago. But when Ethan looked at the family listed, There was no trace of them. No address, no phone number, just a name and nothing else. She's gone, Ethan said, showing the file to Dave. Another one with no follow-up. No way to confirm if she ever made it to the family. Dave leaned over to look at the screen. That's the third one today. And there's more. I'm telling you, Dave, this isn't just incompetence. It's trafficking. Kids are being sold, and no one's asking questions. Dave's expression darkened. If that's true, we're going to need hard evidence. People aren't going to believe it on hearsay. Ethan sat back, feeling the weight of what they were uncovering. We'll find the evidence. I'm not letting this go. But even as he said the words, a creeping sense of dread settled over him. He knew that the deeper they dug, the more dangerous this was going to become. The night air was crisp as Ethan walked toward his car after another long day at the station. The streets were quiet, the town seemingly asleep under the blanket of darkness. But as he reached for his car door, a voice called out from the shadows. Cole. Ethan froze, his hand hovering just above the door handle. He turned slowly, eyes narrowing as a man stepped out of the alleyway nearby. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in dark clothes, his face partially obscured by the low light. I don't know what you think you're doing, the man said, his voice low and threatening. But you need to stop. Now. Ethan's heart raced, but his face remained calm. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you do, the man said, taking a step closer. You're poking around where you don't belong. The orphanage. Those kids. This isn't your fight. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. It is now. The man's expression hardened. You don't understand what you're getting yourself into. There are people who don't want this brought to light. Powerful people. Ethan didn't flinch. I'm not scared of you. The man smirked, though there was no humor in it. You should be. Keep digging, and you won't like what you find. With that, the man turned and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Ethan standing there, heart pounding. Ethan watched him go, a mix of anger and fear bubbling up inside him. He knew this was a warning, but it only solidified his resolve. He wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. When Ethan returned home that night, the house was quiet, but not in the usual oppressive way. The lights were on, and to his surprise, Sophie was sitting on the couch, holding one of the twins in her arms. She looked up as he entered, her face soft, though her eyes still held the shadow of grief. I didn't hear you come in, she said, her voice gentle. Ethan stood for a moment, taking in the sight of her with the baby. It was the first time in months that she seemed present, like she was really there with him. How are they doing? He asked, sitting down beside her. Sophie looked down at the baby in her arms, a small smile tugging at her lips. They're okay. I think they like it here. Ethan smiled faintly, though his mind was still spinning from the day's events. He wasn't sure if he should tell her what had happened with the man outside the station. The last thing he wanted was to burden her with more worries. Sophie glanced at him, sensing his tension. What's wrong, Ethan? You seem distracted. He hesitated, then sighed. It's the case. The orphanage. It's worse than I thought. Sophie's brow furrowed in concern. What do you mean? I can't explain it all right now, he said, running a hand over his face. But I think those kids, I think they're being trafficked, sold to the highest bidder. It's not just about adoption. Sophie's eyes widened, her grip tightening on the baby. That's horrible. It is, Ethan said, his voice thick with frustration. And the people behind it, they're dangerous. I got a warning tonight. A warning? Sophie's voice trembled. What kind of warning? Some guy approached me, told me to stop investigating, or else. Sophie's face paled, fear flashing across her features. Ethan, what are we going to do? We're going to stop them, Ethan said firmly, his resolve unshakable. I don't care who they are or how powerful they think they are. I'm not letting them get away with this. Sophie stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then, slowly, she nodded. Just be careful, please. Ethan reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. I will. I promise. Later that night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Ethan found Leo sitting quietly in the living room, his small body hunched over on the couch. The boy had been quiet since they arrived at Ethan's house, but now something about him seemed different, like he was ready to talk. Ethan sat down beside him, keeping a respectful distance. "Hey, buddy. You okay?" Leo didn't answer right away. He stared at the floor, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his shirt. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "They took them," Leo whispered, his voice barely audible. Ethan frowned. "Who did?" "The other kids," Leo said, his voice trembling. "The ones that didn't get adopted. They took them away. I don't know where, but they never came back." Ethan's heart sank. "Do you know who took them?" Leo nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It was her. Victoria. She would come at night sometimes, with men I didn't know. They would take the kids, and we never saw them again." Ethan felt a wave of anger and disgust wash over him. This was it, the confirmation he had been dreading. Victoria Marsh wasn't just running a corrupt orphanage. She was trafficking children, using the system to make them disappear. "Thank you for telling me, Leo," Ethan said, his voice gentle but firm. "You did the right thing." Leo sniffled, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "Are you going to stop her?" Ethan nodded, determination burning in his chest. "Yes, I'm going to stop her, and I'm going to keep you and the twins safe. I promise." Leo looked up at him, a flicker of hope in his tired eyes. "Okay," he whispered. As Ethan sat there with Leo, the weight of the truth settled heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about solving a case anymore. This was about justice. Justice for Leo, for the twins, and for all the children Victoria had stolen. And Ethan wasn't going to stop until he brought her down. Ethan crouched in the shadows outside the orphanage, his breath visible in the cold night air. The moon, partially hidden behind thick clouds, barely illuminated the dilapidated building before him. He knew what he was about to do was dangerous, both for his career and his life, but he couldn't wait any longer. Too many children were in danger, and he needed proof. He glanced down at the lockpick in his hand. He hadn't done something like this since his academy days, but there was no other option. If Victoria Marsh and her trafficking ring were to be brought down, he needed hard evidence, something to expose the entire operation. The lock clicked open, and Ethan slipped inside, shutting the door quietly behind him. His pulse raced as he moved through the dark hallways, the faint smell of mold and decay hanging in the air. The orphanage was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath his feet. His flashlight beam darted across the walls as he made his way to the office where he suspected Victoria kept her files. He reached the door and took a deep breath before entering. The room was pristine, in stark contrast to the rest of the building. Victoria's desk was meticulously organized, every paper in place. Ethan moved quickly but carefully, rifling through the drawers and cabinets. He knew he didn't have much time before someone noticed he was here. After several tense minutes, he found what he was looking for: files. Dozens of them. Adoption records, financial documents, lists of children's names. But as he flipped through the papers, his stomach turned. The documents weren't just incomplete, they were fraudulent. Children who had supposedly been adopted had no official records, no legitimate families. And worse, there were payments listed, large sums of money exchanged for these so-called adoptions. "This is it," Ethan muttered under his breath. He snapped photos of the files, documenting everything as fast as he could. Just as he closed the last drawer, he heard footsteps approaching. His heart pounded in his chest as he doused his flashlight and pressed himself against the wall, holding his breath. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside the office door. For a moment, Ethan was sure he'd been caught. But after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. Ethan exhaled shakily and wasted no time slipping out of the office and back into the night. He'd done it. He had the proof he needed to bring Victoria down, but he knew the battle was far from over. Ethan arrived home just before dawn, exhausted but filled with a grim sense of determination. He quietly opened the front door, careful not to wake Sophie or the children. He wasn't ready to tell her what he'd done, not yet. But to his surprise, Sophie was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table. The twins were asleep in their carriers nearby, and she had one of the files he'd taken from the orphanage spread out before her. "You're up early," Ethan said cautiously, unsure how to approach the conversation. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes wide and filled with something Ethan hadn't seen in a long time: anger. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but laced with tension. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He should have known he couldn't keep this from her. "It's proof, Sophie. Proof that Victoria's been selling children. Leo, the twins, they were going to be next." Sophie's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the file. It's horrifying." "I know," Ethan said softly, sitting down beside her. "That's why I had to do it. I had to get the evidence to stop her." Sophie stared at him, her eyes searching his face. "But you could have been caught, Ethan. You could have lost everything." "I couldn't just sit back and do nothing," he replied, his voice firm. "These kids, they need us. They need someone to stand up for them." Sophie's gaze dropped to the twins, her expression softening as she reached out to gently stroke one of their tiny hands. "What are we going to do?" "We're going to take this to the authorities," Ethan said, his tone resolute. "We have enough now to bring her down, but we have to move carefully. Victoria's got connections. We can't let her slip away." Sophie nodded, though Ethan could see the fear still lingering in her eyes. "I want to help. I need to help." Ethan placed a hand over hers, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "We'll do this together." For the first time in months, there was a spark of strength in Sophie's eyes, and Ethan knew they were finally on the same page. They were in this fight together, and they wouldn't stop until Victoria was brought to justice. The following days were a whirlwind of preparation. Ethan and Officer Dave worked tirelessly, compiling the evidence and building a case strong enough to withstand Victoria's influence. They interviewed former orphanage workers, tracked down parents of missing children, and gathered testimonies from those who had been too scared to speak before. Each new piece of information only deepened the horror of what Victoria had been doing. Children had been sold to the highest bidder, their lives treated as nothing more than commodities. And Victoria had orchestrated it all, hiding behind her facade of respectability. "We've got enough now," Dave said one evening, dropping a stack of papers onto Ethan's desk. "This is airtight. There's no way she can weasel out of this." Ethan nodded, though a heavy feeling settled in his chest. "We need to move fast. She's going to catch wind of this soon." "I've already spoken with the district attorney," Dave said. "They're arranging the raid, but we need to keep it quiet. If Victoria gets even a hint of what's coming, she'll vanish." Ethan's jaw tightened. "We can't let that happen." Dave looked at him, concern flickering in his eyes. "I know this is personal for you, Ethan, but you've got to keep a level head. We can't afford any mistakes." Ethan met his gaze, his expression grim. "Don't worry, Dave. I'm not letting her slip through my fingers." But even as he said the words, Ethan couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. He was close, closer than ever to bringing Victoria down. But something told him the worst was yet to come. The night of the raid arrived faster than Ethan had expected. The tension in the air was palpable as the team assembled outside the orphanage, their breath visible in the cold night air. Patrol cars were stationed at strategic points around the building, ready to block any attempt at escape. Ethan stood at the front of the group, his heart pounding as he stared at the orphanage. This was it, the culmination of weeks of investigation, of risk, of sleepless nights. He was going to bring Victoria down. Dave approached him, his voice low. "We're ready. The team's in position." Ethan nodded, glancing over at the officers who were prepared to storm the building. "Let's do this." They moved in swiftly, the doors to the orphanage bursting open as the team entered, spreading out through the building. Ethan's pulse raced as he led the charge, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. They found children huddled together in small, cramped rooms, scared, malnourished, and confused. But as the officers escorted the children to safety, Ethan's focus was on one person, Victoria Marsh. He reached her office, kicking the door open with a force that rattled the walls. There she was, sitting at her desk, calm and composed, as if she hadn't just been caught orchestrating one of the most horrific trafficking rings Ethan had ever seen. Victoria looked up, her eyes cold and calculating. "Officer Cole, I was wondering when you'd show up. Ethan's blood boiled, but he forced himself to stay calm. It's over, Victoria. We have everything. The files, the testimonies. You're going to prison for the rest of your life. Victoria leaned back in her chair, a slight smirk tugging at her lips. You think you've won? You think this is the end? Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. It is for you. But Victoria's smirk didn't falter. I have friends in high places, officer. You can take me down today, but I'll be out before you can even blink. You haven't stopped anything. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. I don't care how many friends you have. You're not getting away with this. Victoria's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of fear in them. But before he could say another word, Dave appeared at the door. We've got her, he said, his voice filled with relief. The raid went smoothly. It's over. Ethan nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. They'd done it. They'd stopped Victoria. But as he looked down at her, handcuffed and led out of the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was far from over. Back at the station, Ethan sat at his desk, exhausted but relieved. The raid had been a success. The children were safe, and Victoria was behind bars. But as he sifted through the last of the evidence, something caught his eye. A name that shouldn't have been there. Ethan's heart stopped as he stared at the file in front of him. It was a record from years ago, one of the earliest cases of a child being trafficked through the orphanage. And the child's name was his son. His breath caught in his throat, the room spinning around him. His son, his beautiful boy, hadn't died in an accident. He'd been taken, just like Leo and the others. Ethan's hands trembled as he pieced it together. The trafficking ring, the adoption scams. It had all led back to his own child. And now, the truth was staring him in the face, threatening to tear him apart. A wave of anguish and fury crashed over him. This was personal. It had always been personal. And now, Ethan had a choice to make. Pursue justice or seek revenge. Ethan stood outside the interrogation room, his heart pounding in his chest. Behind the glass, Victoria Marsh sat calmly, her hands folded neatly on the table. Despite her arrest, she exuded an air of confidence, as if none of this fazed her. Her perfectly groomed appearance remained intact, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of annoyance. Ethan clenched his fists at his sides, the anger rising inside him like a tidal wave. Everything he had uncovered, the trafficking, the lies, the children who had been taken, including his own son, it was all because of her. And now, she sat there, smug, like she hadn't orchestrated one of the most horrific operations he had ever encountered. You ready for this? Dave asked, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan nodded, though his jaw remained tight. I have to be. As they entered the room, Victoria's cold gaze shifted to them, her lips curving into a faint smile. Ah, Officer Cole. I've been expecting you. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his eyes locked onto hers. It's over, Victoria. We have the evidence. We've rescued the children. There's no way out for you. Victoria's smile widened, a condescending chuckle escaping her lips. You think this is over? My dear, you have no idea how deep this goes. You can take me down, but I am merely a cog in a much larger machine. Do you really think the people I work for will allow this to happen without consequence? Ethan's anger flared, but he forced himself to remain calm. You're going to prison, Victoria. And your connections? They won't protect you. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. You're wrong, officer. You've uncovered a few inconvenient truths, yes, but you've barely scratched the surface. There are people in this town, people in positions of power, who won't let you win. Ethan's fists clenched under the table, but he didn't let her see the effect she was having on him. I don't care who's backing you. You sold children, innocent lives, to the highest bidder. And I'm going to make sure you pay for every single one of them. Victoria's eyes flickered with something darker, fear, perhaps, or frustration. But her calm mask remained in place. You're blinded by your own pain, Cole. You're no hero. You're just a man desperate to fill the void left by your son's death. The words struck Ethan like a punch to the gut. He felt the heat rise to his face, But he couldn't lose control now. Not with her. "You don't get to talk about my son," Ethan growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't get to use him as a way out of this." Victoria tilted her head slightly, the smirk fading. "You're right. But it doesn't matter. This isn't over." Ethan pushed back his chair and stood, his eyes never leaving hers. "For you, it is." As he turned to leave, Victoria's voice echoed behind him. "You'll regret this, Officer Cole. You have no idea what you've started." Ethan ignored her, his mind focused on the next step. The raid was coming, and soon, Victoria's entire operation would crumble. But her warning lingered in his mind, a seed of doubt he couldn't shake. The sun was beginning to set as Ethan, Dave, and the team gathered outside the orphanage, ready to move in. The tension was thick in the air, every officer on edge as they prepared to bring down the trafficking ring once and for all. Ethan adjusted his bulletproof vest, his heart racing in anticipation. This was it. Everything they had worked for was about to come to a head. "Everyone knows the plan," Dave said, his voice calm but authoritative. "We move in quietly, secure the children, and take down anyone involved. No one escapes." Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the building before him. The thought of what they might find inside made his stomach churn, but he pushed it aside. There was no room for hesitation now. The signal was given, and the team moved in, breaking down the door and flooding into the orphanage. The sight that greeted them was worse than Ethan had imagined. Children were huddled together in small, dark rooms, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. The rooms were filthy, the stench of neglect hanging heavy in the air. As the officers moved through the building, they found more and more children, some as young as infants, locked away like prisoners. "Get them out of here," Ethan ordered, his voice tight with anger. "Make sure they're safe." As the children were escorted out of the building, Ethan and Dave continued searching, determined to find the people responsible. They knew Victoria's operation went deeper than just her. In the basement, they found a series of hidden rooms, makeshift cells where the children had been kept before being sold. The sight of it made Ethan's blood run cold. "We need to document all of this," Dave said, snapping photos of the horrific scene. "This is the evidence we need to bury her." Ethan nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He had to find more. He had to know if his son had been here, if he had been one of the victims of this operation. In one of the back rooms, Ethan found a filing cabinet, its contents hastily thrown about as if someone had tried to cover their tracks. He sifted through the papers, his hands shaking as he came across a file with his son's name on it. His breath caught in his throat as he opened the file, his heart pounding in his chest. The document confirmed his worst fears. His son hadn't died in an accident. He had been targeted by the same trafficking ring that Victoria had been running. His son had been taken, and the so-called accident had been a cover-up. Ethan's vision blurred with rage and grief. His son had been a victim of the very people he was trying to take down. And now, he was faced with a choice: pursue justice for all the children or seek revenge for his son. "Ethan," Dave's voice broke through the fog of anger in his mind. "We found more files. This is bigger than we thought." Ethan looked up, his jaw clenched. "I know, but this just got personal." Back at home, Ethan sat in the kitchen, the weight of the truth pressing down on him like a crushing force. Sophie sat across from him, her face pale as he told her everything, about the trafficking ring, about the children they had saved, and about their own son. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes, but she didn't break down. Instead, she reached across the table and took Ethan's hand, her grip strong and steady. "We'll get through this," Sophie said, her voice trembling but filled with determination. "We'll get justice for our son." Ethan looked at her, surprised by the strength in her voice. "I don't know if I can do this, Sophie. I don't know if I can hold back." Sophie shook her head, her eyes locking onto his. "You have to, Ethan. For the children we saved, for the twins, for Leo. If you lose yourself in this, we lose everything." Ethan swallowed hard, the rage inside him threatening to consume him. But Sophie's words brought him back, grounding him in the reality of what they had to do. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "We'll bring her down. The right way." Sophie nodded, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. We'll make sure she never hurts anyone again. The next morning, Victoria Marsh was formally charged with human trafficking, child endangerment, and a slew of other crimes. The media swarmed the courthouse as she was led inside, handcuffed and flanked by officers. Ethan stood at the back of the courtroom, watching as the case unfolded. The evidence they had gathered was overwhelming, and Victoria's cold demeanor finally began to crack under the weight of it all. But as the trial progressed, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over. Victoria had powerful connections, and even though she was facing justice now, there were others out there. Others who had profited from this horrific operation. As the judge handed down her sentence, Ethan felt a sense of closure, but it was tinged with sadness. Justice had been served, but the pain of losing his son would never fully go away. After the trial, as Victoria was led away in handcuffs, she shot Ethan one last look, a look of pure hatred. "This isn't over," she mouthed, her eyes burning with fury. But Ethan didn't flinch. He had done what he needed to do, and now he had to focus on the future, on the children he had saved, on Sophie, and on the family they were rebuilding. As he left the courthouse, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter, though he knew the road ahead would still be long and difficult. But for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt hope, and that was enough. Ethan stood at the window, watching the rain drizzle softly against the glass. It was a far cry from the violent storm that had changed his life just months ago. Behind him, Sophie was sitting on the living room floor with the twins, playing with soft toys. Leo sat nearby, quietly drawing in a notebook. The atmosphere in the house had shifted. There was still grief, still pain, but there was also something else, hope. Sophie's laugh brought him out of his thoughts. He turned to see her smiling as one of the twins giggled at the toy she held. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental to Ethan. Sophie had come so far from the hollow, broken woman she had been after their son's death. She had begun to heal, slowly but surely, and it was the presence of these children that had sparked that change. "Look at you," Ethan said, smiling as he walked over and sat down beside her. "You're a natural." Sophie glanced up at him, her eyes soft. "It feels good to care for them." Ethan nodded, reaching out to brush his hand gently across one of the twins' heads. "We're doing it, Sophie. We're getting through this," she sighed, leaning into him. "I never thought I'd feel this again," she admitted quietly. "The love, the connection. After we lost him, I didn't think it was possible." "We'll never forget him," Ethan said, his voice low, "but we've been given a second chance. These kids, they need us as much as we need them." Sophie smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. "I'm ready, Ethan. I'm ready to move forward." He kissed her forehead gently, feeling the weight of everything they had been through lift just a little. They were healing together. The process of officially adopting Leo and the twins was far from easy. The bureaucracy, the legal hurdles, they made everything move at a frustratingly slow pace. But Ethan and Sophie pushed through it all, determined to give these children a permanent home. One afternoon, they sat in the office of a social worker, filling out yet another stack of paperwork. Leo sat in the waiting area with the twins, patiently entertaining them while Ethan and Sophie spoke with the caseworker. "You're aware that this process could take months, possibly longer," the social worker said, adjusting her glasses as she looked over their files. "Given the circumstances, we'll do everything we can to expedite it, but these things take time." Sophie nodded, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "We understand," she said softly. "We just want to give them the life they deserve." The social worker smiled kindly. "It's clear that you both care deeply for these children. That's the most important thing." Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice firm. "We're committed to this, no matter how long it takes. These kids are already a part of our family." The social worker made a few notes before looking up at them again. "I'll make sure everything is handled as quickly as possible. In the meantime, keep doing what you're doing. You're giving them stability, and that's more valuable than anything right now." As they left the office, Leo looked up at Ethan. "Is everything okay?" Ethan smiled down at him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Yeah, buddy. Everything's going to be fine." Weeks passed, and the house slowly began to feel like a home again. Leo, who had been so quiet and reserved when Ethan first found him, started to open up. It was gradual, small steps here and there, but it was progress. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Leo surprised Ethan by sitting down beside him on the couch, holding a book. "Can you read this to me?" Leo asked quietly, looking up at Ethan with wide, hopeful eyes. Ethan's heart swelled as he nodded, taking the book from Leo's hands. "Of course," he said, pulling the boy close as they settled in. As Ethan read, his voice soft and steady, Leo rested his head against Ethan's arm, a gesture that felt monumental given how guarded the boy had been. By the time they reached the end of the story, Leo was nearly asleep, his small body curled up against Ethan's side. For a long moment, Ethan just sat there, holding the boy close, feeling an overwhelming sense of love and responsibility. He had lost his son, but now he had been given the chance to be a father again. As he gently moved to carry Leo to bed, the boy stirred, looking up at him with sleepy eyes. "Good night, Dad," Leo murmured before drifting off again. Ethan froze, his heart skipping a beat. "Dad." The word echoed in his mind, filling him with both joy and sorrow. It was the first time Leo had called him that. He carried Leo to his room, tucking him in gently. As he stood in the doorway, watching the boy sleep, Ethan felt a tear slip down his cheek. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that word, how much it meant to him. The day of the final adoption hearing arrived, and Ethan and Sophie walked into the courtroom hand in hand. Leo and the twins were with them, the entire family dressed in their best clothes, nervous but hopeful. The judge, a stern-looking woman with kind eyes, reviewed their case before finally looking up at them. "It's clear that you've provided these children with a stable, loving home," she said, her voice warm. "And it's my pleasure to grant your petition for adoption." Ethan felt Sophie squeeze his hand as the judge stamped the final documents, sealing the adoption. It was official. They were now the legal parents of Leo, Emily, and Emma. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes, and Ethan wrapped an arm around her, feeling a sense of relief and joy wash over him. They had done it. They had built a family from the ashes of their pain. As they left the courtroom, Leo looked up at Ethan, a small smile on his face. "We're a real family now, right?" Ethan knelt down in front of him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We've always been a family, Leo. This just makes it official." Leo grinned, his eyes bright with happiness, and for the first time, Ethan saw the boy truly at peace. The sun shone brightly as they stepped out of the courthouse, a stark contrast to the stormy night when Ethan had first found Leo and the twins. The sky was clear, and the warmth of the sun felt like a blessing after months of darkness. Ethan stood with Sophie, Leo, and the twins, taking a deep breath of the fresh air. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future didn't seem so bleak. It was filled with hope, with the promise of new beginnings. Sophie slipped her hand into Ethan's, and he looked down at her, smiling. "We made it," she said softly, her voice filled with wonder. Ethan nodded, his heart full. "Yeah, we did." As they walked together toward the car, Leo ran ahead, laughing as he played with the twins. Ethan watched them, a sense of peace settling over him. He knew they still had a long road ahead. There would be challenges, there would be memories that hurt, but they would face it all together. The rain had washed away the past, and now, beneath the bright sky, Ethan knew they had finally found their way forward. And that was enough.